I'm a forensic pathologist at Riverside County Medical Examiner's Office in Cedar Falls, Oregon, or at least I was, until I submitted my resignation 6 weeks ago. You can call me Dr. Helena Blackwood if you want. But what I'm about to tell you about is the one case that made me question everything I thought I knew about death itself, and ultimately led me to leave forensic pathology entirely. For 21 years, I served as the senior medical examiner for Riverside County, one of the most challenging and complex coroner's offices on the Pacific Northwest coast. During more than 2 decades in forensic pathology, I've performed over 4,000 autopsies. I've examined bodies recovered from devastating mudslides in the Cascade Mountains, drowning victims pulled from the turbulent waters of the Columbia River, gunshot wounds from methamphetamine-related violence that plagued our rural communities, overdose deaths from fentanyl that swept through our region like a plague, and every conceivable manner of death that human beings can experience in both urban and wilderness settings. I've testified in over 600 criminal trials, worked with DEA task forces on cases involving international drug trafficking operations, consulted with the FBI on serial murder investigations that crossed state lines, and served as the primary forensic pathologist for mass casualty events that made international headlines. I've examined bodies in every state of decomposition imaginable, from fresh deaths discovered within minutes to mummified remains found decades after disappearance in the remote forests and mountain caves that dot our region. My expertise extended far beyond routine autopsy procedures. I specialized in toxicological analysis of rare poisons and environmental contaminants, forensic anthropology for skeletal remains recovery, and underwater recovery techniques for bodies found in the numerous rivers, lakes, and coastal areas throughout Riverside County. I had developed innovative methods for determining time of death in challenging environmental conditions, techniques that were adopted by medical examiners' offices across the country, and published in peer-reviewed journals that are now considered standard references in forensic pathology education programs. Cedar Falls sits at the confluence of 3 major river systems, surrounded by dense forests, steep mountain terrain, and some of the most unforgiving wilderness in the Pacific Northwest. Our jurisdiction covers over 2,800 square miles of diverse geography, from urban areas with populations exceeding 400,000 to remote wilderness regions where a body might not be discovered for years. We handle approximately 1,800 deaths annually, ranging from natural deaths in nursing facilities to complex homicide investigations involving organized crime networks that operate throughout the I-5 corridor from Mexico to Canada. The environmental challenges of our region created unique forensic problems that required specialized knowledge and equipment unavailable to most medical examiners' offices in more temperate climates. Bodies recovered from mountain environments at elevations above 6,000 feet present dramatically different decomposition patterns than those found at sea level due to reduced oxygen content, extreme temperature fluctuations, and exposure to ultraviolet radiation that can preserve some tissues while rapidly destroying others. Victims of hypothermia in our harsh winters, where temperatures can drop to -20 degrees Fahrenheit for weeks at a time, show distinct physiological changes in blood chemistry and organ structure that can be easily misinterpreted by pathologists unfamiliar with cold weather death investigations. River drownings in our fast-moving waterways, fed by snowmelt from glaciated peaks and swollen by Pacific storm systems, often result in extensive post-mortem trauma as bodies are carried for miles downstream, bouncing off rocks and submerged debris, creating injury patterns that can obscure evidence of pre-mortem violence or foul play. I had become expert at distinguishing between trauma caused by drowning and river transport versus injuries inflicted before death, knowledge that had proven crucial in solving numerous homicide cases where perpetrators had attempted to disguise murders as accidental drownings. The dense forest environments that cover over 70% of our jurisdiction present their own forensic challenges. Bodies concealed in old-growth timber, where sunlight never reaches the forest floor and humidity levels remain constant year-round. undergo decomposition processes that follow completely different timelines than those described in standard forensic pathology textbooks. The presence of specific insect species, soil acidity levels affected by decomposing organic matter, and seasonal variations in temperature and precipitation all factor into determining when and how someone died in these environments. I had become the regional expert on environmental forensic pathology, frequently called upon by medical examiners' offices in Washington, California, Idaho, and Alaska when they encountered cases involving similar geographic and climatic challenges. My research on high-altitude death investigations had been published in the Journal of Forensic Sciences, the American Journal of Forensic Medicine and Pathology, and the International Journal of Legal Medicine. My techniques for analyzing decomposition rates in Pacific Northwest forest environments were taught at the Armed Forces Institute of Pathology, the National Association of Medical Examiners training programs, and forensic pathology residency programs at major medical schools throughout the United States and Canada. The Riverside County Medical Examiner's Office, where I worked for over 2 decades, is housed in a state-of-the-art facility completed in 2012, designed specifically to handle the unique challenges of forensic investigation in our region. The building features 6 fully equipped autopsy suites with advanced negative pressure ventilation systems capable of safely handling even the most severely decomposed remains discovered months or years after death. A comprehensive toxicology laboratory, certified for analysis of over 400 different drugs, poisons, and environmental contaminants, digital radiography systems capable of detecting foreign objects as small as individual shotgun pellets or fragments of glass, and climate-controlled evidence storage facilities that can maintain the integrity of physical evidence for decades during lengthy legal proceedings and appeals processes. Our forensic anthropology laboratory, one of only 12 such facilities in the United States, contains specialized equipment for skeletal analysis, facial reconstruction, and age determination techniques that can identify remains even when traditional methods fail. We maintain a collection of over 3,000 skeletal specimens representing different age groups, ethnicities, and pathological conditions used for comparative analysis when working with fragmentary or damaged remains. Our DNA analysis capabilities, developed in partnership with the Oregon State Police Forensic Laboratory, can extract genetic profiles from tissue samples that other laboratories consider too degraded for analysis. The facility also houses a specialized underwater recovery training center, the only one of its kind in the Pacific Northwest, where law enforcement divers from throughout the region train in body recovery techniques for rivers, lakes, and coastal waters. I had personally designed the training protocols used in this facility, drawing on 2 decades of experience with underwater death investigations and recovery operations in some of the most challenging aquatic environments in North America. Our staff included 4 board-certified forensic pathologists, each with specialized expertise in different aspects of death investigation, 12 death investigators trained in crime scene analysis and evidence collection, who work rotating shifts to provide 24-hour coverage throughout our jurisdiction, 6 toxicologists with advanced degrees in analytical chemistry and expertise in mass spectrometry and chromatographic analysis, and a support team of administrators, photographers, evidence technicians, and legal specialists who handle the complex paperwork and court scheduling that accompanies every suspicious death investigation. We maintained close working relationships with law enforcement agencies throughout the region, from small-town police departments dealing with their first homicide case in decades to federal agents investigating international criminal organizations involved in human trafficking, drug smuggling, and organized violence. I had served as the primary forensic consultant for joint task forces involving the FBI, DEA, ATF, U.S. Marshals Service, and Customs and Border Protection, providing expert analysis in cases that ranged from domestic terrorism to mass casualty events involving chemical or biological weapons. My typical workday began at 5:30 a.m., arriving at the office before dawn to review overnight death reports transmitted electronically from hospitals, police departments, and emergency response agencies throughout our coverage area. These reports included preliminary information about the circumstances of death, initial observations by responding officers or medical personnel, and photographs of the scene and body position that would guide my decisions about autopsy priority and the specific examinations required for each case. By 6 a.m., I would be reviewing case files in detail, examining crime scene photographs with magnification equipment to identify potential evidence that might not be visible to the naked eye, studying medical records and toxicology reports from treating hospitals, and planning the day's autopsy schedule based on the urgency of pending investigations, the complexity of examination required for each case, and the availability of specialized equipment or consulting experts who might be needed for unusual findings. The actual autopsy process, which most people never see or understand, is far more complex and time-consuming than television portrayals suggest. Each examination begins with extensive external documentation, photographing every visible mark, wound, or abnormality on the body from multiple angles, using specialized lighting techniques that can reveal injuries or evidence invisible under normal illumination. Measurements are taken using precision instruments, recording the exact location, size, and characteristics of every finding. Clothing is carefully removed, using techniques that preserve potential trace evidence, with each garment photographed, measured, and packaged separately for laboratory analysis. Detailed notes are recorded about everything from the condition of fingernails, which can contain DNA evidence from an attacker, to the presence or absence of rigor mortis in specific muscle groups, which provides crucial information about time of death and body position after death occurred. Lividity patterns, the pooling of blood in dependent body parts after circulation stops, must be carefully documented and correlated with the position in which the body was found to determine whether it was moved after death. The internal examination requires methodical dissection of every organ system, following protocols developed over decades of forensic medicine to ensure that no evidence is missed or contaminated during the examination process. Each organ is removed, weighed, and measured, with detailed notes recorded about any deviation from normal anatomy or pathology. The heart is examined for evidence of disease, trauma, or congenital defects that might have contributed to death. The lungs are analyzed for signs of drowning, asphyxiation, or toxic gas exposure. The liver and kidneys are evaluated for evidence of poisoning, drug overdose, or chronic disease processes. The brain examination is particularly complex, requiring specialized techniques to remove the organ without damage while preserving evidence of trauma, disease, or toxicological effects. Brain tissue is sectioned using precision instruments and examined microscopically for cellular changes that can indicate the cause of death, the presence of drugs or poisons, or the timeline of events leading to death. Blood, urine, bile, and tissue samples must be collected using sterile techniques and properly preserved for toxicological analysis that can take weeks or months to complete, depending on the complexity of substances being analyzed and the sophistication of testing required. These samples are tested for hundreds of different drugs, poisons, environmental contaminants, and naturally occurring toxins that can cause death. The chain of custody for all specimens must be carefully documented to ensure that evidence will be admissible in court proceedings. Every finding must be photographed using high-resolution digital cameras with specialized lenses and lighting equipment, measured using precision instruments, and described in detail, sufficient to support testimony in court proceedings that might not occur for months or even years after the examination. The final autopsy report, which can range from 20 to over 100 pages depending on the complexity of the case, must be written in language that is scientifically accurate but understandable to judges, juries, and attorneys who lack medical training. Throughout my career, I had developed a reputation for thoroughness that bordered on obsession. Other pathologists might complete a routine autopsy in 3 to 4 hours. I regularly spent 6 to 10 hours on each case, examining every detail that might provide insight into the circumstances of death. This meticulous approach had helped solve cases that initially appeared to be natural deaths, but were actually cleverly concealed homicides, had identified rare toxins that other pathologists missed during their initial examinations, and had provided the definitive evidence needed to convict murderers who thought they had committed the perfect crime. I had consulted on cases that made national and international news, including the investigation of a serial killer who operated along truck stops throughout the Pacific Northwest for over 15 years, killing at least 23 victims before being apprehended, based largely on forensic evidence I had developed from his earliest crimes. I had worked on a mass poisoning incident at a corporate retreat that initially appeared to be foodborne illness, but was actually an attempted murder involving a rare botanical toxin that required months of specialized analysis to identify. I had provided crucial forensic analysis in the identification of victims from a commercial airliner crash in the Cascade Mountains, where bodies were scattered across miles of rugged terrain and exposed to the elements for months before recovery teams could reach the site. My expertise in toxicology had been crucial in solving cases involving exotic poisons obtained from plants and animals in remote regions of the world, environmental contaminants released by industrial accidents or illegal dumping, and unusual drug interactions that can cause unexpected deaths in individuals taking multiple medications. I had testified as an expert witness in federal court about the effects of industrial chemicals on human physiology, had lectured at international conferences about advances in post-mortem toxicological analysis, and had served as a consultant to pharmaceutical companies investigating adverse drug reactions that resulted in fatalities during clinical trials. My work had contributed to changes in federal regulations governing workplace safety, environmental protection standards, and pharmaceutical testing requirements. I had served on advisory committees for the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention, the Environmental Protection Agency, and the Food and Drug Administration, providing expert guidance on the health effects of various chemicals and the development of safety standards to protect public health. But perhaps most importantly, I had built my entire professional identity around the belief that death, despite its mystery and finality, could be understood through rigorous scientific analysis. I believed that every death had an explicable cause that could be determined through careful examination of the physical evidence left behind in the human body. I believed that the tools of modern forensic pathology, advanced imaging techniques, sophisticated laboratory analysis, microscopic examination of cellular changes, and comprehensive toxicological testing could provide definitive answers about how and why someone died, regardless of how unusual or complex the circumstances might appear. This scientific certainty had sustained me through 2 decades of examining the most tragic and violent deaths imaginable. It had allowed me to maintain professional objectivity while testifying about child abuse cases that made experienced police officers weep, to provide clinical analysis of mass casualty events that traumatized entire communities, and to find meaning and purpose in work that most people would find emotionally unbearable and psychologically destructive. I had seen every form of violence that human beings can inflict upon each other, every type of accident that can claim a life, every disease process that can end human existence. I had examined the bodies of infants who died from genetic disorders so rare that only a few dozen cases had ever been documented in medical literature, and elderly patients who had survived to ages that challenged our understanding of human longevity and the biological limits of lifespan. I had performed autopsies on professional athletes in peak physical condition who died suddenly from undiagnosed heart defects that were undetectable during life, and on individuals whose bodies had been so damaged by disease, trauma, or environmental exposure that identification required advanced DNA analysis and forensic reconstruction techniques using facial approximation and skeletal analysis methods. In every case, regardless of how unusual or challenging the circumstances, I had been able to provide scientific answers. I had been able to explain to grieving families how their loved ones died, to provide law enforcement with the evidence needed to solve crimes and prosecute perpetrators, and to contribute to the body of medical knowledge that helps prevent similar deaths in the future through improved safety regulations, medical treatments, and public health interventions. My confidence in the ability of forensic pathology to explain death was absolute and unshakable. I had built a career on the premise that death, however mysterious it might seem to lay people, was ultimately a biological process that could be understood, analyzed, and explained through scientific investigation using established medical principles and advanced analytical techniques. I believed that consciousness was simply a function of electrochemical brain activity, that death occurred when that activity ceased permanently, and that the physical changes that occur after death followed predictable patterns that could be measured, documented, and used to determine the time, manner, and cause of death with scientific precision. I believed that any apparent mysteries surrounding death was simply the result of insufficient information or inadequate analytical techniques, and that with enough time, resources, and expertise, every death could be explained through the application of scientific methodology. This worldview had served me well throughout my career, and had earned me recognition as one of the leading forensic pathologists in the Pacific Northwest and beyond. I had received awards from professional organizations including the National Association of Medical Examiners, the American Academy of Forensic Sciences, and the International Association of Forensic Sciences. I had been invited to lecture at medical schools, law enforcement academies, and continuing education conferences throughout North America and Europe. I had built a reputation for solving the most complex and challenging death investigations in our region, and had consulted on cases that stumped experienced pathologists at major medical centers throughout the United States. But all of that certainty, all of that professional confidence, all of those fundamental beliefs about the nature of death and consciousness would be shattered by what I encountered on the morning of March 15th, 2024. What I discovered that day would challenge not just my understanding of forensic pathology, but everything I thought I knew about what happens to human consciousness when the body dies, and whether death itself might be far more complex and mysterious than our current medical knowledge suggests. The case that would destroy everything I believed about death began with what appeared to be a routine suicide. On the surface, it seemed like the kind of case I had handled hundreds of times before. Tragic, certainly, but medically straightforward, with a clear cause of death that would require minimal investigation. I had no way of knowing that this single case would lead me down a path of discovery so disturbing, so fundamentally challenging to our understanding of human consciousness and the nature of death itself, that it would ultimately force me to question whether everything we think we know about what happens when we die might be completely wrong. What I'm about to tell you will sound impossible. It will challenge everything you think you know about death, consciousness, and the very nature of human existence. I understand if you find it difficult to believe, because I lived through it, and I still struggle to accept what I witnessed with my own eyes, documented with my own hands, and recorded using the most advanced forensic equipment available to modern medicine. But I'm telling you this story because I believe people have a right to know that death might not be the simple biological process we've always assumed it to be. The case involved a 28-year-old woman named Isabella Chen, a software engineer who had moved to Cedar Falls 3 years earlier to work for one of the tech companies that had been drawn to our region by tax incentives and the availability of highly educated workers from the nearby university. By all accounts, Isabella was intelligent, well-liked by her colleagues, and had no history of mental health problems or substance abuse. She lived alone in a downtown apartment, maintained regular contact with her family in San Francisco, and had been planning a vacation to visit her sister in New York just days before her death. On the morning of March 14, 2024, Isabella failed to show up for an important meeting at work. When repeated phone calls and text messages went unanswered, her supervisor asked the building manager to perform a welfare check at her apartment. What they found appeared to be a straightforward case of suicide by hanging. Isabella's body was discovered in her bedroom, suspended from a ceiling beam by a rope made from twisted bedsheets. There was no sign of forced entry, no evidence of a struggle, and no indication that anyone else had been present in the apartment. The responding officers from Cedar Falls Police Department followed standard protocol for suspected suicide cases, securing the scene and calling for a medical examiner investigation. The death investigator who responded that afternoon was Marcus Rivera, one of our most experienced team members who had worked hundreds of similar cases during his 15-year career. His preliminary report noted nothing unusual about the scene or the circumstances of death. Everything appeared consistent with suicide by hanging, including the position of the body, the type of ligature used, and the absence of defensive wounds or signs of struggle. Isabella's body was transported to our facility late that afternoon and scheduled for autopsy the following morning. Based on the scene investigation and preliminary findings, I expected this to be a routine examination that would confirm the obvious cause of death and allow us to issue a death certificate within 24 hours. Suicide cases, while tragic, rarely present forensic mysteries or unexpected findings that require extensive investigation. But from the moment Isabella's body arrived at our facility, strange things began to happen that had no logical explanation and violated everything I thought I knew about the physiology of death. These weren't subtle abnormalities that might be dismissed as unusual but explainable variations. These were impossible findings that challenged the fundamental principles of forensic pathology and human biology. The first sign that something was profoundly wrong occurred during the initial external examination, before I had even begun the formal autopsy procedure. As I was photographing and documenting the ligature marks on Isabella's neck, I noticed something that should have been impossible given the circumstances of her death and the amount of time that had elapsed since she was discovered. Her body temperature, measured using our standard digital thermometer, was 98.2 degrees Fahrenheit, essentially normal body temperature for a living person. This finding was medically impossible. Isabella had been dead for at least 18 hours based on when she was last seen alive and when her body was discovered. In that time, especially in the cool temperature of her apartment, her body should have reached ambient temperature hours earlier. Post-mortem body temperature follows predictable patterns that are used to help determine time of death, and there is no known mechanism by which a dead body can maintain normal temperature for extended periods without external heat sources. But the temperature reading was just the beginning. As I continued the external examination, I noticed that Isabella's body showed none of the expected signs of death that should have been present given the time frame. There was no rigor mortis, the stiffening of muscles that typically begins within hours of death. There was no livor mortis, the pooling and settling of blood that creates distinctive discoloration patterns in dependent parts of the body. Her skin color and texture appeared completely normal, without the pallor and waxy appearance characteristic of death. Most disturbing of all, when I pressed gently on her fingernails to check for capillary refill as part of the routine examination, the nail beds blanched white and then returned to their normal pink color within seconds, exactly as they would in a living person. This capillary refill response requires active circulation of blood through the cardiovascular system, which is impossible after death. I immediately called in Dr. Sarah Martinez, our senior pathologist, to observe these findings and confirm that I wasn't making some fundamental error in my examination. Dr. Martinez had 30 years of experience in forensic pathology and had performed over 6,000 autopsies during her career. When she examined Isabella's body and witnessed the same impossible findings, her reaction was one of complete bewilderment. "Helena," she said, her voice tight with confusion and something approaching fear, "this body is exhibiting signs of life, but that's medically impossible given the circumstances of death and the time frame involved. We need to stop this examination immediately and figure out what's happening here. What we discovered next would change everything I thought I knew about death, consciousness, and the very nature of human existence. It would lead to the most disturbing and unexplainable case in the history of forensic pathology, and ultimately force me to confront the possibility that our understanding of death itself might be fundamentally flawed.